The ground splits open in the middle of City Z, and for a moment nobody understands what they are looking at, because the shockwave that just tore through 6 city blocks did not come from an explosion, a monster, or a weapon anyone recognizes. Buildings lean inward like they are bowing to something. Glass rains down in sheets, and a lone figure stands at the center of it, all wearing a yellow jumpsuit stained with dust, looking mildly annoyed rather than victorious. Genos is already running toward him, sensors screaming with numbers that should not be possible, because the punch that just landed did not just defeat an enemy, it left a fracture in the world that nobody can explain yet. Somewhere in a Hero Association command center, an alarm nobody has ever heard before starts flashing red, because whatever Saitama has been quietly doing every night for the past few months just stopped being a secret, and what comes next will make this moment look small. Saitama had told Genos he was going out for groceries, and technically that was true, because he did stop by the convenience store on his way to an abandoned quarry 20 miles outside City Z. What Genos did not know, what nobody knew, was that for the last 4 months Saitama had been slipping away after midnight to a place where the rock walls were already scarred with craters nobody had ever reported, testing something he could not quite explain even to himself. He stood at the bottom of the pit that night, flexing his hand, staring at a boulder the size of a delivery truck, and for the first time since he became a hero, he was not bored. He was curious. Something about the last few weeks felt different, like his fist was starting to answer a question he had not asked yet, and that unfamiliar feeling was enough to keep him coming back night after night, alone, telling no one. The boulder did not survive the punch, but neither did the ridge behind it, or the hillside behind that, and the tremor rolled outward far past where Saitama expected it to stop. He blinked at the new canyon stretching into the darkness, scratched his bald head, and muttered that he probably should have picked a spot farther from the highway. He was already turning to leave when the ground kept shaking, low and steady, long after the shockwave should have faded, and that was the first sign that something about tonight was not behaving the way his training normally did. Saitama frowned, waited, and felt it again, a second pulse rolling through the bedrock like an echo that refused to die. And for a man who never worried about anything, he found himself actually paying attention. 12 miles away, a seismograph in a Hero Association substation spiked so hard the technician on duty thought his equipment was malfunctioning, because nothing natural produces a reading like that, and nothing artificial should either. He flagged it as an anomaly and moved on, because low-priority tremors got filed and forgotten every week, and nobody connected it yet to a bald hero in a yellow suit standing alone in a canyon he had just created by accident. Genos, back at the apartment, noticed his master return past 3 in the morning with dust on his boots and a strange focus in his expression that Saitama almost never wore. And when Genos asked where he had been, Saitama just said the store was crowded and left it there. Genos filed that answer away the way he filed everything, quietly, patiently, because something about his master's routine had been shifting for weeks, and his sensors, upgraded and precise, were beginning to notice patterns that did not fit anything in his data on Saitama's known abilities. 3 days later, a low-tier monster attack broke out downtown. Nothing special, the kind of thing Saitama handled in his sleep, except this time when his punch connected the monster did not simply die. It disintegrated in a way that sent a visible pressure wave rippling through the street, cracking windows 2 blocks away and knocking pedestrians off their feet who were nowhere near the fight. Saitama looked down at his own fist like it had done something without asking his permission first, muttered that he really needed to be more careful, and walked off scratching his head while bystanders stood frozen, staring at cracked storefronts they could not explain. A news crew caught grainy footage of the aftermath, not the punch itself, just the damage radius, and by that evening the clip was circulating with a caption asking what kind of hero produces a blast wave from a routine C-class threat. Inside Hero Association headquarters, An analyst pulled the footage alongside the substation's forgotten seismic reading from 3 nights earlier, and for the first time, someone connected the two anomalies to the same general time frame and the same general district. Nobody had a name for what was happening yet, no threat classification, no official concern, only a quiet unease settling over a handful of people who dealt in patterns for a living. Saitama, meanwhile, was already back in his quarry that night, standing over a fresh boulder, feeling that same unfamiliar pull in his chest, unaware that somewhere in the city, people had just started asking questions about him that he was not ready to answer. The analyst who first connected the seismic reading to the street footage was named Kuroda, a mid-level data officer nobody important ever listened to. But he was stubborn enough to keep digging even after his supervisor told him it was probably nothing. He pulled satellite imagery of the quarry Saitama had been using and found 4 months of overlapping craters, layered on top of each other like a timeline of something growing steadily worse. And when he mapped the dates against Saitama's known mission logs, the pattern matched almost perfectly with nights the man had listed as personal time. Kuroda brought it to his supervisor a second time, and this time the supervisor actually looked, because craters that size did not belong to any registered hero's power profile on file, not even close, and the idea that this had been happening quietly for months without anyone noticing was enough to make even a skeptical bureaucrat uneasy. Within a day, the file reached Sitch, and Sitch did what Sitch always did. He treated it as a containable oddity rather than a threat, because in his experience, unexplained anomalies from B-class or lower heroes usually turned out to be equipment error or exaggeration. Sitch dispatched a low-key observation team rather than raising any alarm, a pair of junior analysts with drone equipment, ordered simply to monitor Saitama's movements for a week and report anything unusual without engaging or informing him. That decision would later be remembered as the first mistake, the moment the association chose quiet surveillance over an actual conversation, treating the strongest man in their organization like a variable to be measured instead of a person to be asked. Saitama, of course, noticed the drone almost immediately, because a floating camera hovering outside a quarry at 1 in the morning is not exactly subtle, and he walked straight up to it, waved awkwardly, and said he was just doing some exercise before smashing his way through another round of boulders anyway, unbothered by being watched. The footage that came back to headquarters showed something none of the analysts were prepared for, not because of the destruction itself, but because of what the ground did afterward, a visible shudder spreading through solid rock in a way that defied every physics model they tried to run it against. Genos was the one who finally forced the issue into the open, because his own independent tracking of his master's absences had been building for weeks, and when Hero Association contacted him directly asking whether he had noticed anything strange about Saitama's recent behavior, Genos realized the organization already knew more than he did. That stung him in a way he did not entirely expect, because he had spent years trying to understand his master's power through direct observation and study, and the thought that Saitama had been hiding something even from him felt like a quiet failure of his own dedication. Genos confronted Saitama that same evening, calm on the surface but insistent underneath, asking directly what the training was actually for, since it clearly was not the same routine from 3 years ago. Saitama, sitting on the couch eating instant noodles, shrugged and said he did not fully know yet either, that something about his strength had started feeling different recently, like there was a ceiling somewhere he had not hit before, and he wanted to find out what happened if he kept pushing toward it. That answer, simple as it sounded, told Genos more than any classified report could have, because if even Saitama himself did not understand what was happening, then whatever this was could not be dismissed as ordinary training anymore. Genos reported the conversation back to headquarters almost word for word, and for the first time, the association's internal threat board, updated Saitama's classification from Unknown Anomaly to Category Watch, a designation normally reserved for emerging dragon-level threats rather than their own registered heroes. Sitch, reading the update that night, felt the first genuine flicker of concern he had experienced in years, because a hero whose own power was starting to surprise even himself was not a problem the organization had ever prepared a protocol for. Across the city, Saitama returned to his quarry as usual, unaware that the eyes on him had multiplied overnight, and unaware that somewhere in that boulder field, his next punch was about to answer a question 3 separate organizations were now quietly trying to ask. Within 48 hours of the classification change, Hero Association leadership convened an emergency session that Saitama was not invited to, a decision that would later be criticized internally but felt reasonable to the executives in the room at the time, because nobody wanted to alarm a hero who might not even understand what he was becoming. The board debated 3 options: monitor him quietly and hope the pattern plateaued, approach him directly and request he suspend independent training until they understood the risk, or begin drafting containment protocols in case his power continued escalating without warning. Sitch pushed hard for direct contact, arguing that treating their own hero like a ticking threat would only damage trust and potentially provoke the very instability they feared. But the majority sided with caution, and caution in Hero Association's institutional language always meant surveillance first, conversation later. The decision was made to expand the observation team, bring in a materials scientist to analyze the quarry site directly, and quietly restrict Saitama's mission assignments to lower-risk zones under the excuse of routine rotation, none of which was explained to him honestly. Saitama noticed the change in his assignments almost immediately, because his mission board suddenly filled with mole hunts and lost cat calls instead of the C-class monster work he usually handled. And being Saitama, he did not overthink it. He just assumed the system was being weird again the way it always was. What he did not know was that the materials team sent to his quarry that week found something the analysts back at headquarters were not prepared to explain, because the crater floor showed compression fractures extending nearly 40 meters below the surface, far deeper than the visible damage suggested, as if the force of his punches was continuing to travel through solid rock long after the initial impact ended. The lead scientist, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Ishikawa, flagged the readings as physically inconsistent with any known application of force, and in her report she used a phrase that would later circulate through every subsequent briefing, describing the phenomenon as an accumulating pressure signature rather than a single discrete blow. That phrase reached Genos before it reached most of the board, because Dr. Ishikawa reached out to him directly, having read his own extensive files on Saitama's physiology and combat data. Hopping the cyborg hero might have insight the rest of the organization lacked. Genos studied her readings for hours, cross-referencing them against every recorded punch he had personally witnessed, and arrived at a theory he found both fascinating and unsettling: that Saitama's strength was not simply increasing in raw output the way a weightlifter adds muscle, but was instead becoming more efficiently transmitted, as if something in his body was learning to waste less force with every repetition. If that theory held, it meant there was no theoretical ceiling anyone could point to, no known biological or physical limit that would eventually cap his growth, which was precisely the kind of open-ended possibility that made cautious administrators deeply uncomfortable. The board's unease turned into something closer to alarm 3 days later, when a routine mission finally forced Saitama back into real combat, a rogue demon-class creature that had slipped past a containment team near the industrial district, far stronger than the mole hunts he had been assigned all week. Saitama arrived, mildly irritated at having his evening interrupted, and ended the fight in a single motion the way he always did, Except this time, the surrounding steel framework of 3 warehouses folded inward from the pressure alone, without ever being touched, collapsing in a slow, unnatural cascade that terrified the containment team stationed a full block away. Photographs of the wreckage reached the board within the hour, and for the first time, several executives who had dismissed the earlier reports as exaggeration sat in stunned silence, because untouched buildings do not fold like that from ordinary force, and everyone in that room understood they were no longer discussing a hypothetical. Sitch used the moment to push through his original proposal, insisting the association needed to talk to Saitama honestly before fear turned into a decision they could not walk back, and the board reluctantly agreed to authorize a formal meeting, the first direct acknowledgement that something about their strongest hero had fundamentally changed. But even as the meeting was being scheduled, a separate memo was already circulating quietly among a smaller group of senior officials, one that used a colder, more clinical phrase than anyone had spoken aloud yet, asking what containment options existed if voluntary cooperation failed. Saitama, walking home that night past collapsed warehouses he barely remembered touching, was thinking about instant noodles and nothing else, entirely unaware that the organization he worked for had just quietly begun asking whether he could be stopped if he ever needed to be. The meeting happened on a Tuesday afternoon in a conference room too formal for a man who showed up in the same yellow suit he wore everywhere else, and Saitama sat there listening politely, while Sitch and 2 board members explained, as gently as they could, that his recent training had produced measurable anomalies they needed to understand. Saitama did not get defensive. He just nodded along and admitted openly that yes, something had been changing in him for months, that his punches felt like they were reaching further than his arm actually moved, and that he honestly did not know where the ceiling was anymore because he had not found one yet. When Sitch asked why he never reported any of this, Saitama shrugged and said it did not seem important, since nothing had actually gone wrong, and besides, he was still just punching things the same way he always had, only somehow the results kept getting bigger without him trying any harder. That answer, delivered with total sincerity, unsettled the room more than any dramatic confession could have, because it confirmed the one possibility everyone had been quietly dreading, that Saitama himself was not driving the escalation on purpose and therefore could not simply choose to stop it. The board asked him to pause independent training until Dr. Ishikawa's team could study the phenomenon properly, and Saitama, easygoing as ever, agreed without protest, genuinely willing to cooperate since nobody had actually forbidden him from anything before, and being asked nicely was enough for him. What none of them accounted for was Genos, who left that meeting deeply shaken, not by Saitama's answers, but by the private memo Dr. Ishikawa had shown him earlier that week, the one discussing containment contingencies in cold administrative language as though his master were a natural disaster rather than a person. Genos, usually disciplined about protocol, made a decision that surprised even himself. He leaked a redacted version of that memo to a contact he trusted at a mid-sized news outlet, believing the public deserved to know their heroes were being quietly assessed as threats rather than protected as people, and believing Saitama deserved better than being managed behind his own back. The story broke 2 days later under a headline that spread faster than anyone at the association anticipated, framing Saitama not as a hero secretly growing stronger, but as an uncontrolled variable the organization itself was afraid of, and public reaction split instantly into 2 loud, competing camps. Some citizens rallied around him, arguing that a hero willing to cooperate honestly deserved trust rather than suspicion, flooding social media with support and turning Saitama's blank public persona into an unlikely symbol of quiet reliability. Others reacted with genuine fear, pointing to the collapsed warehouses and the fractured quarry bedrock as proof that something dangerous was being underestimated, demanding the association explain exactly what safeguards existed if their strongest hero ever lost control or turned hostile, a scenario nobody could actually rule out anymore. The pressure forced Hero Association into a position they had spent weeks trying to avoid, a public statement, and the one they issued satisfied almost no one, vague enough to avoid admitting fear, specific enough to confirm that anomalous readings were indeed under investigation. Sitch, watching the fallout unfold, understood immediately that the leak had changed the entire shape of the situation, because what had been a quiet internal concern was now a citywide conversation, and citywide conversations invited attention from people far less patient than his own board. That attention arrived within the week in the form of a coalition of independent monster research groups and several foreign defense observers, all suddenly very interested in a Japanese hero, whose power apparently had no confirmed ceiling, each for reasons that had little to do with public safety and everything to do with strategic advantage. Saitama, mostly unaware of how large the story had grown, noticed only that people on the street were staring at him more than usual, some nervously, some with an odd kind of excitement, and he found the whole thing mildly annoying since none of it changed what he actually wanted, which was simply to understand what his body was becoming capable of. Genos, watching the consequences of his own leak ripple outward faster than expected, began to feel the first real weight of what he had done, realizing that in trying to protect his master's dignity, he may have exposed him to a far larger and more dangerous kind of scrutiny than any classified memo ever could have. That night, as international observers began quietly requesting access to Hero Association's files, and as a foreign defense liaison drafted the first in a series of increasingly serious briefings back to his own government, Saitama sat on his couch eating discount instant ramen, completely unaware that his secret training had just become the most closely watched phenomenon on the planet. The briefing that landed on a defense minister's desk 3 time zones away did not use Saitama's name at first. It referred to him only as Subject Zero, a designation chosen by an analyst who wanted the report taken seriously by people who might otherwise dismiss a bald superhero as a punchline. The report laid out everything: the quarry craters, the warehouse collapse, Dr. Ishikawa's compression fracture data, and Genos' leaked theory about efficiently transmitted force with no known ceiling. And it ended with a single conclusion that moved the file from a regional curiosity desk to a full national security review, stating plainly that no existing weapons platform could guarantee containment if Subject Zero's power continued its current trajectory. Within days, similar briefings were circulating among 3 other governments, each independently reaching the same uncomfortable conclusion, and what had started as Hero Association's internal problem was now something several militaries considered a matter of strategic planning rather than domestic hero management. Japan's own defense ministry, embarrassed at being one step behind foreign intelligence services on a story that had broken publicly in their own newspapers, moved quickly to establish a liaison office directly inside Hero Association headquarters, officially framed as a cooperative monitoring initiative, unofficially understood by everyone involved as oversight with teeth. Sitch resisted the arrangement as much as institutional politics allowed, arguing that treating Saitama like a national security asset would only validate the fear narrative the leak had already created. But he lost that argument once a foreign carrier group was quietly repositioned in international waters near the coast, ostensibly for unrelated training exercises that convinced absolutely no one who was actually paying attention. Saitama, still cooperating fully with his training pause, noticed a new group of stern-faced men in dark suits attending his checkups alongside Dr. Ishikawa's team, and when he asked who they were, One of them answered vaguely about interagency coordination, and Saitama simply shrugged and asked if the appointment would take long because he wanted to catch a sale on cup ramen. The turning point came when Dr. Ishikawa's team, running increasingly precise measurements during supervised sparring sessions against controlled test constructs, recorded something that ended any remaining hope of quiet management. A single restrained punch against a reinforced test barrier that not only destroyed the barrier, but registered a seismic footprint detectable by monitoring stations over 600 kilometers away. The data reached every government watching the situation within hours, and what had been strategic caution turned into something closer to controlled panic, because a hero capable of producing detectable global seismic activity from a single restrained blow was no longer a regional curiosity. He was potentially the single most significant variable on the planet's military balance. Emergency consultations began among allied nations, not about how to neutralize Saitama. None of them believed that was realistically possible anymore, but about how to ensure no hostile actor could ever provoke him, manipulate him, or worse, replicate whatever process was making him stronger. Genos, watching international attention swirl around his master with a mixture of pride and dread, requested and received permission to remain by Saitama's side at all times during official monitoring, partly out of loyalty, and partly because he had begun to suspect that the pressure building around this situation would eventually require someone Saitama actually trusted to intervene before politics made a bad decision on his behalf. That instinct proved accurate faster than Genos expected, because within the liaison office, a hardline voice began arguing for a far more aggressive posture, insisting that a contingency strike plan should exist regardless of whether it was ever used, purely as an insurance policy against the possibility that Subject Zero's escalation eventually crossed into instability. Sitch pushed back hard in every meeting he attended, reminding the room that Saitama had done nothing but cooperate fully since the moment he was asked. But cooperation from a man capable of shaking the earth with a single punch inspired less trust among frightened officials than anyone in that room wanted to admit. The final development that pushed this phase toward outright crisis arrived quietly, in the form of a classified satellite tasking request approved without public knowledge, redirecting reconnaissance assets to maintain continuous coverage over Saitama's residence and known movement patterns, treating a cooperative hero exactly the way a hostile state actor would be tracked. Saitama had no idea any of this was happening as he sat in Dr. Ishikawa's lab that evening, staring at his own hand under harsh fluorescent light, quietly asking her the one question nobody in any government briefing had thought to ask him directly, wondering aloud whether she had any idea what he might actually be turning into. Dr. Ishikawa, for the first time in the entire investigation, had no answer to give him, and outside the building, unnoticed by either of them, a satellite passed silently overhead, recording every second of a conversation the rest of the world was already treating as the opening chapter of a crisis far larger than one man punching rocks in a quarry. The contingency plan that emerged from the liaison office over the following week was never officially named a strike plan in any document that might leak. It was labeled instead as a regional stabilization framework, a phrase bland enough to survive a records request while still describing, in painstaking technical detail, what a coordinated multinational response would look like if Subject Zero's power ever turned outward without warning. Sitch was shown the document under strict confidentiality and felt something close to nausea reading it, because buried beneath the careful bureaucratic language was a simple, brutal premise that if Saitama could not be trusted indefinitely, the only remaining option under consideration involved overwhelming force applied before he could react, a strategy every planner in the room privately doubted would actually work, but felt obligated to draft anyway. He argued forcefully against even maintaining the document, insisting that planning to kill their own cooperative hero on the basis of statistical anxiety was not defense policy. It was fear dressed up as procedure. But the liaison office kept the framework active, filed and ready, because in their calculus doing nothing felt like the greater risk. Genos learned about the framework's existence through Dr. Ishikawa, who had grown increasingly uncomfortable with how her research was being weaponized against the very man cooperating fully with every test she ran. And this time Genos did not leak anything. He went directly to Saitama and told him the truth without softening it, that some people in positions of real power were now quietly planning for the possibility of having to stop him by force. Saitama listened, finished the cup of instant noodles he had been eating, and asked only one question, wanting to know if anyone had actually asked him what he intended to do with his strength before jumping straight to planning how to kill him over it. Genos admitted that no one had, and Saitama nodded slowly, not angry exactly, but with a stillness that Genos had rarely seen in him, the same quiet shift his master's expression took on right before something genuinely serious happened, and it worried Genos more than any explosion ever could have. That stillness became public knowledge the following afternoon, when Saitama, still technically under his voluntary training pause, was called in for a routine checkup, and instead walked straight past Dr. Ishikawa's lab into the executive floor, asking to speak with whoever was actually in charge of the framework Genos had described to him. The request caused visible panic among junior staff, because nobody had prepared for the possibility that their subject of intense secret planning would simply walk in and ask about it directly. And Sitch, hearing the commotion, intercepted him personally rather than let the meeting spiral into something worse. Saitama did not raise his voice, did not threaten anyone. He simply asked Sitch plainly whether it was true that people were planning to kill him if his training kept going the way it had been. And when Sitch, to his credit, answered honestly that such a contingency did exist, Saitama absorbed the answer without visible anger, only a long, quiet pause that unsettled everyone in the room far more than shouting would have. He told Sitch that he understood why people were scared, that he probably would be too in their position, but that hiding a plan to kill him instead of just talking to him was the kind of thing that made him actually consider whether cooperation was worth it anymore. And for the first time since this entire situation began, Saitama's tone carried an edge that made clear his patience, while genuine, was not infinite. Sitch, recognizing the danger of losing that patience entirely, made an unauthorized decision on the spot, promising Saitama that he personally would push to have the framework shelved and replaced with an actual dialogue process. A promise he knew would cost him politically, but one he judged necessary to prevent the exact outcome everyone claimed to be trying to avoid. That confrontation, reported quietly up every chain of command within hours, forced the liaison office into an emergency session that fractured along predictable lines. The hardliners insisting Saitama's directness only proved he was becoming unpredictable. The moderates arguing that his restraint under direct provocation was the strongest evidence, yet that he had no hostile intent at all. No consensus emerged that night, only a fragile, temporary stand-down of active contingency, planning pending further review. A decision that satisfied no one completely but bought a narrow window of calm. Saitama walked home that evening past a city that had spent weeks debating whether to plan his death, thinking mostly about how annoying today had been, unaware that the temporary stand-down he had just earned through sheer directness was the only thing standing between his ordinary life and a decision that could never be undone. The fragile calm lasted 11 days, broken not by Saitama, but by something entirely outside anyone's planning, a dragon-class monster designation nobody had seen before, emerging from a fault line near the same quarry Saitama had spent months training in, as though something about the accumulated pressure signature Dr. Ishikawa had been documenting for weeks had finally disturbed something ancient sitting beneath the bedrock. The creature that surfaced was massive and covered in cracked obsidian-like plating, and unlike every monster Saitama had casually erased before, this one did not simply charge in blindly. It moved with a strange, deliberate caution, circling the perimeter of the crater field as if it recognized the ground itself and understood exactly what had been happening there. Hero Association scrambled every available S-Class hero to the site within minutes, and for the first time in this entire saga, Saitama arrived not as a background afterthought, but as the explicitly requested primary response, the framework debate momentarily forgotten in the face of an actual emerging threat. Bang and Tatsumaki reached the site moments after Saitama, both having heard enough rumors over the preceding weeks to approach the situation with far more caution than they normally extended to anything below Dragon Class themselves. Tatsumaki, never one to hide her skepticism, hovered above the crater field with her arms crossed, openly telling anyone listening that she intended to judge Saitama's supposed power herself rather than trust second-hand reports. And Bang, quieter but equally attentive, positioned himself where he could observe without interfering, curious whether the calm young man he had sparred with once truly carried the weight everyone now feared. Saitama, characteristically unbothered by an audience of the two strongest heroes in the organization, walked toward the creature without hesitation, mentioning offhand that he had actually been hopping for something a bit more interesting than mole hunts lately. The creature reacted to his approach in a way nothing had before, planting itself and releasing a low resonant pulse from its plated hide, a defensive frequency that shattered nearby windows and knocked both Bang and Tatsumaki back several meters. And for one brief, genuinely startling moment, Saitama actually staggered half a step, the first time observers had ever seen him physically affected by an opponent's attack rather than simply ignoring it. Tatsumaki's breath caught, not from fear exactly, but from the sudden collision of every assumption she carried about this man crumbling in real time, because staggering, however slightly, was not something the rumors had prepared her to witness. Saitama straightened, rolled his shoulder once, and muttered that the pulse actually tickled a little, an admission that read as absurd bravado to anyone who hadn't just watched genuine surprise flicker across his face half a second earlier. What happened next became the encounter every witness would describe differently for years, because Saitama did not simply throw his usual single decisive punch. He paused, visibly considering the creature the way a craftsman studies a stubborn piece of material, and then delivered a strike deliberately restrained, testing rather than finishing, curious what the plated hide could actually withstand. The plating held for a fraction of a second longer than absolutely nothing, a delay so small most observers missed it entirely. But Tatsumaki, whose telekinetic senses processed force differently than ordinary perception, felt that fractional resistance distinctly, and it was the first time in her life she had ever detected anything surviving contact with Saitama's fist even briefly. The creature's plating then failed catastrophically, the resonant pulse collapsing inward on itself as the shockwave finally overcame whatever unnatural density had been resisting it, and the surrounding crater field expanded outward in a ring of fractured earth that swallowed nearly a quarter-mile of terrain nobody had accounted for in any evacuation plan. Bang, staring at the newly transformed landscape, spoke quietly to Tatsumaki that the resistance they had just witnessed, however brief, meant something the reports had failed to capture, that whatever Saitama's training had been building toward was not simply raw power accumulating without limit. It was power learning to meet resistance it had never previously encountered, and that distinction terrified him more than raw destruction ever could. Tatsumaki said nothing for a long moment, watching Saitama casually brush dust off his sleeve as though he had not just proven, in front of the two people least likely to be impressed by rumor alone, that something in the world had finally pushed back against him, even if only for an instant. As Hero Association's cleanup teams moved in to survey a fault line now measurably larger than the one Dr. Ishikawa had been monitoring for months, A fragment of the creature's shattered plating was recovered intact, and its composition, once analyzed, would raise a question far more disturbing than anything the contingency framework had ever considered, because nothing on record explained where a material capable of briefly resisting Saitama's strength could possibly have originated. Dr. Ishikawa's lab received the recovered plating fragment under maximum security clearance, and within hours, her team confirmed what the initial field analysis had only suspected, that the material's molecular structure did not match anything cataloged in Hero Association's extensive monster physiology database, nor did it resemble any known geological formation from that region. The fragment's crystalline lattice showed evidence of having been compressed under repeated, directional force over an extended period, not the random pressure of tectonic activity, but something closer to deliberate, patterned stress, the exact kind of stress Saitama's nightly training had been generating in that same crater field for months. Dr. Ishikawa sat with that data for a long time before she allowed herself to say the theory out loud to Genos, that the creature they had just fought might not have been an ordinary monster stirred awake by coincidence, but something that had been slowly forming and hardening beneath the earth precisely because of the accumulated force Saitama had been pouring into that ground night after night, an unintended consequence of his own secret training taking physical shape. Genos absorbed the theory in silence, running his own independent calculations against her data, and arrived at a conclusion that disturbed him even more than hers, because if sustained exposure to Saitama's punches could compress ordinary rock into something capable of briefly resisting him, then every quarry, every collapsed warehouse, every fractured street across the city was now a potential site where the same slow process could be quietly underway. He brought this possibility to Sitch immediately, and Sitch, already worn thin from weeks of managing a crisis that kept refusing to plateau, ordered an emergency geological survey of every location where Saitama had ever fought at full or near full strength, a list that by now stretched across dozens of districts and had grown far too long to secure quietly. The survey results came back over the following 3 days, and while most sites showed nothing beyond ordinary damage, 2 locations returned readings disturbingly similar to the quarry, faint but measurable density anomalies forming deep beneath the surface, patterns Dr. Ishikawa's team now recognized as the earliest possible stage of the same hardening process. One of those sites sat directly beneath a densely populated residential district, and the moment that detail reached the board, the tone of every conversation in Hero Association changed, because this was no longer an abstract question about Saitama's personal power ceiling. It was now a concrete, physical threat quietly growing underneath thousands of sleeping civilians who had no idea anything was happening beneath their homes. Saitama, told plainly what the survey had found, reacted with none of the detachment he usually carried, because for the first time this entire situation had crossed the one line that reliably shifted his behavior, the safety of people who had done nothing to deserve being caught in the middle of whatever he was becoming. He asked Dr. Ishikawa directly whether his training was the cause, and when she confirmed, carefully, that the evidence strongly suggested it was, Saitama sat quietly for a long moment before saying that he would stop training in populated areas immediately and permanently, and that he wanted every site checked personally, starting with the one under people's homes, before anyone slept another night without knowing what was underneath them. Genos had rarely seen his master commit to something with that particular weight in his voice, and he understood in that moment that whatever curiosity had driven Saitama's secret training for the past several months had just collided head-on with the one thing that had always mattered more to him than understanding his own strength. The excavation beneath the residential district was handled quietly, under cover of a fabricated utility repair, and when Saitama himself descended into the access tunnel to assess the anomaly directly, he found a formation roughly the size of a delivery van, dark and faintly warm to the touch, its surface bearing the same faint crystalline structure as the fragment recovered from the fault-line creature. He did not punch it. For the first time in the entire story, Saitama chose not to use his strength on something directly in front of him, instead calling Dr. Ishikawa down to examine it properly, because some instinct told him that meeting this thing with force was exactly what had created the last one, and he was not willing to risk creating another beneath people's homes to satisfy his own curiosity. Dr. Ishikawa's team began the delicate process of controlled extraction that night, and as the formation was carefully lifted free of the tunnel floor, sensors briefly detected something that made every technician in the room go quiet. A faint resonant pulse from deep within the formation itself. The same frequency the fault-line creature had released, as though it were responding to something, or someone, still out there. The resonant pulse detected inside the extracted formation, repeated at almost exactly 6-hour intervals over the following 2 days, and Dr. Ishikawa's team, monitoring it around the clock, eventually realized the pattern was not random static, but something closer to a signal, faint and directional, aimed outward past the city, past the coastline, toward open ocean where no one had any obvious reason to be listening. She brought the finding to Sitch with a theory she hated saying out loud, that the formations were not simply inert byproducts of Saitama's training, they were behaving like some kind of dormant relay, and if something out there was capable of receiving that signal, then whatever had been sleeping beneath this city might not be the only one, and it might not be alone much longer. The answer arrived 4 days later, not as a monster alert, but as a series of overlapping seismic readings from 3 separate ocean monitoring stations, each detecting the same rhythmic pulse Dr. Ishikawa's team had already identified, now echoing back from deep water roughly 200 kilometers offshore, growing steadily stronger rather than fading. Hero Association scrambled naval reconnaissance, alongside 2 of the foreign liaison teams who had been quietly stationed nearby since the earlier contingency debates, and what their sensors found beneath the waves defied every classification system anyone in that command room had ever used, a structure kilometers wide, buried under sediment for what geological estimates suggested was centuries, now unmistakably active. Its outer shell pulsing in perfect rhythm, with the fragment sitting in Dr. Ishikawa's containment lab. Bang was the first canon character to voice what everyone in the room was quietly thinking, that this was no longer a story about one man's strength growing unpredictably. It was a story about something ancient that had been waiting, patiently, for exactly the kind of force capable of waking it. And Saitama's secret training, whatever its original intent, had apparently supplied precisely that. Tatsumaki, reviewing the sonar imagery with her usual sharp skepticism, was the one who noticed the detail that turned unease into outright alarm, that the structure's outer shell bore the same crystalline compression pattern as both recovered fragments, meaning it had not simply been buried by geological accident. It had been slowly hardening the exact same way, just on a scale that made the residential district formation look like a pebble. Saitama received the full briefing standing in Dr. Ishikawa's lab, staring at live sonar footage of something ancient stirring awake because of him. And for once he did not crack a joke, did not scratch his head, did not ask when dinner was. He simply asked what would happen if it fully woke up before anyone figured out how to stop it. Nobody in the room had a confident answer, and that silence told him everything he needed to know about the scale of what his months of quiet curiosity had actually set in motion. Genos, watching his master absorb that silence, understood that the story had crossed permanently out of the territory of training and curiosity, into something that would now define the rest of Saitama's life regardless of what happened next. Because there was no version of events anymore where this simply faded quietly back into routine mission work. The structure breached the surface 11 hours later, near dawn, close enough to coastal shipping lanes that evacuation orders went out across 3 prefectures within minutes, and what rose from the water was not a single creature but a colossal shell-like formation, cracking open along seams that had clearly been designed, not grown, releasing a low continuous pulse that every hero and soldier within 50 kilometers felt in their chest before they heard it in their ears. Hero Association's entire command structure, military liaisons, and every S-class hero available converged on the coastline within the hour, watching as the shell's fractures widened further with each pulse. And Saitama stood at the front of that assembled force, staring at something that had apparently been sleeping under the ocean, specifically because it was waiting for someone exactly like him to arrive. The shell finished cracking open just as the sun cleared the horizon, and what emerged from inside it was not a creature in any conventional sense, but something that looked almost deliberately built, a towering humanoid framework of the same dark crystalline material, easily 300 meters tall, its joints glowing faintly with the same resonant frequency that had been calling out to it for days. It did not roar, did not charge. It simply stood upright in the shallows, turning its featureless head slowly across the assembled forces on the coastline until its attention settled with unmistakable deliberateness directly on Saitama, as though it had been searching specifically for him and had finally found what it came for. Tatsumaki, hovering at altitude to keep visual on the entire formation, radioed down that the thing's internal structure was still hardening in real time, actively compressing itself denser with every passing second, and that whatever this was, it had clearly not finished becoming whatever it was going to be. Bang moved to intercept first, testing the giant's reaction with a probing strike aimed at its lower leg joint, and his blow connected with enough force to have shattered stone 100 times over. Yet the giant barely shifted, its crystalline plating absorbing the impact and redistributing it outward in visible cracks of light that sealed themselves shut within seconds. Bang retreated immediately, calling out over comms that conventional force was clearly not going to work here, that this thing had been built, or had built itself, specifically to withstand exactly the kind of power it had been listening for, and that meant Saitama's usual approach carried a very real risk of feeding its strength rather than destroying it. Sitch, coordinating from a mobile command post further inland, ordered every non-essential unit to fall back to a containment perimeter, aware that if Bang's assessment was correct, this fight was about to become something the organization had never actually prepared a real plan for, despite months of contingency debates about Saitama himself. Saitama stepped forward anyway, ignoring the retreat order, walking calmly into the shallows toward a being 300 meters tall that had apparently been sleeping under the ocean for centuries waiting specifically for him. He did not look worried, and for the first time in the entire crisis, that lack of worry actually made sense to the people watching, because everyone present had already seen what happened when this man decided a threat had genuinely earned his full attention. The giant lowered one massive crystalline hand toward him, slow and almost curious rather than aggressive, and Saitama studied it for a moment before saying, out loud, to no one in particular, that he finally understood what all those months of training had actually been for, not to get stronger for its own sake, but because something out here had been waiting for someone strong enough to answer it, and ignoring that would have only meant it kept waiting and growing, until it found someone far worse suited to face it. The hand descended, and Saitama caught it with both palms, bracing against a force that finally, for the first time in his entire life, required him to actually plant his feet and push back rather than simply absorb the blow standing still, sending a shockwave rippling outward across the water in a ring visible from orbit. Tatsumaki, watching from above, felt her own telekinetic senses strain just processing the scale of the collision, and she realized, with a clarity that silenced every remaining doubt she had carried about him, that she was not watching a fight anymore. She was watching two forces the size of natural phenomena testing each other for the first time in recorded history. Saitama held the hand in place for a long moment, feeling the density of the crystalline structure pressing against him, and then, Without any dramatic build-up, without a single word of explanation to the giant looming over him, he pushed back. The giant's arm shattered from the shoulder down, crystalline fragments the size of buildings raining into the ocean in an explosion of light and pressure that sent a wall of displaced water crashing across the coastline hard enough to flood the outer edge of the containment perimeter itself. The giant staggered backward for the first time, its remaining hand instinctively rising to shield the ruined socket where its arm had been. And in that single motion, every hero and soldier watching understood they were witnessing something that had never happened before in this creature's long, patient sleep. The first time in its unknown history that it had actually been hurt. Saitama stood in the shallows, dripping, staring up at the wounded giant with an expression that had finally shifted from calm curiosity into something colder and more focused. And he told it quietly, almost gently, that if it had simply wanted to talk, waking up in the middle of a city full of innocent people had been an incredibly bad way to start that conversation. The giant's wounded roar was not sound in any normal sense. It was a pulse of pure pressure that rolled outward across the water and slammed into the coastline with enough force to level the outer containment structures, sending soldiers and support heroes scrambling as makeshift barriers buckled under a wave nobody had equipment rated to withstand. Sitch, watching his forward command post shake violently around him, made the call every contingency meeting for the past 2 months had been quietly building toward, ordering full evacuation of the remaining coastal zones while authorizing heavy air support to provide whatever cover they could, fully aware that conventional weapons had already proven useless against this thing's plating and hopping only to buy civilians time rather than actually contribute to the fight. Genos, who had been holding position at the perimeter against direct orders to stay back, made his own choice in that moment, launching himself toward the battle not to fight the giant, which he understood immediately was beyond him, but to physically shield a group of stranded evacuation workers caught in the open when the pressure wave hit. The decision cost him badly, because as he pulled the last worker clear of the collapsing dock structure, a secondary tremor from the giant's next movement brought down a support pylon directly onto his exposed side, crushing through reinforced plating that had survived worse in the past, but had never been tested against force originating from something this scale. Genos went down hard, systems screaming warnings faster than he could process them, and for one suspended moment it looked, to everyone watching the feed from command, like the fight had just claimed its first real casualty among people who actually mattered to Saitama personally. Saitama felt it before he saw it, some instinctive shift in his periphery that told him his student was down, and the stillness that had been building in him since the shell first broke open finally resolved into something the entire battlefield would remember, a total, absolute focus that made the giant's continued advance suddenly feel almost irrelevant to him. He did not run to Genos, because running would have meant taking his eyes off the giant for even a moment, and some part of him understood with total clarity that hesitation now would only get more people killed. So instead he closed the distance to the giant itself in a single motion too fast for most of the cameras to properly capture, driving a blow into its chest that carried none of the earlier testing curiosity, only pure, undiluted intent. The crystalline plating across the giant's entire torso did not simply crack this time. It detonated outward in a shockwave that flattened the remaining coastal structures for over a kilometer inland, converting the giant's core into a spray of fragmenting light and superheated debris that rained down across water and shoreline alike. The giant did not stagger this time. It simply stopped, its massive frame swaying once before collapsing backward into the ocean with an impact that registered on seismographs 3 continents away, its long, patient sleep and brief, violent waking both ending in the same instant. The silence that followed was total, broken only by the receding hiss of steam rising off cooling fragments scattered across the waterline. And Saitama, standing in the wreckage of a fight that had just permanently rewritten every threat classification system Hero Association maintained, turned immediately away from the fallen giant toward the collapsed dock, where Genos still lay pinned beneath twisted support beams. He reached his student in seconds, tearing through metal and concrete with an urgency that had nothing to do with strength being tested, and everything to do with fear finally showing plainly on his face. The first genuine fear anyone in this story had witnessed from him since it began. Genos was alive, badly damaged, his internal systems fighting to stabilize critical failures, but alive, and Saitama carried him out of the wreckage himself, refusing to hand him to the medical teams rushing forward until he was certain his student was actually going to survive the trip. Dr. Ishikawa, arriving at the scene alongside the first wave of recovery personnel, found herself staring at a battlefield that had permanently altered the coastline's geography. A 300-meter creature's remains scattered across kilometers of shoreline, and a hero who had just demonstrated, beyond any remaining doubt or contingency debate, that his power had no discernible upper limit at all. She also found, buried in her own readings from the final blow, something that would reshape the next phase of the crisis entirely, evidence that the giant's core, in the instant before it shattered, had released a final concentrated pulse of the same resonant frequency that had called it awake in the first place, a signal that this time had been detected not by ocean monitoring stations, but by something considerably farther away. Listening from somewhere, no one on the coastline that morning could have possibly imagined. Genos survived, though the repairs took weeks and left him with a redesigned internal frame that Dr. Ishikawa's team helped engineer specifically to withstand force on a scale nobody had needed to plan for before that morning. And the first thing he said to Saitama when he finally regained full function was not a question about the giant, or the ocean, or the signal, but a simple statement of gratitude for being carried out instead of left behind. An admission of feeling that surprised them both in a story that had rarely paused long enough for either of them to acknowledge it directly. Saitama, sitting beside the recovery bed eating instant noodles he had smuggled past hospital staff, just shrugged and said that was what training partners did for each other. But the weight behind his usual casual deflection told Genos everything he needed to know about how close that morning had actually come to a different outcome. The public reaction to the coastline battle dwarfed everything that had come before it, because this time there was no ambiguity to argue over, no grainy footage open to interpretation. Satellite imagery and eyewitness accounts from 3 separate countries confirmed a 300-meter ancient structure destroyed by a single hero in under 4 minutes. And the debate that had once split public opinion between admiration and fear collapsed almost entirely into something closer to awe mixed with a new, more sober caution. Hero Association's board convened one final emergency session, not to discuss containment anymore. Everyone in that room understood containment had never been a realistic possibility, but to formally acknowledge what Sitch had been arguing for months, that their strongest hero required an entirely new category of classification, protocol, and support, one built around partnership rather than surveillance. Because the world had just watched what happened when he was the only thing standing between civilians, and something ancient enough to have been waiting centuries to wake up. Dr. Ishikawa's final analysis of the giant's remains confirmed what her earlier fragment data had already suggested, that Saitama's punches had not simply grown stronger over the months of training. They had begun operating on a level of force transmission the natural world itself apparently recognized and responded to. The crystalline formations having been, in her final report's carefully chosen words, an ecosystem-level reaction to a variable that should not naturally exist, and yet undeniably now did. That conclusion answered the question that had haunted the entire investigation since Genos first noticed his master's strange nightly absences, revealing that Saitama's secret training had never simply been about testing personal limits for curiosity's sake. It had been, without his full awareness until the very end, the exact catalyst required to draw something ancient and dangerous out of hiding before it could grow strong enough to threaten the world on its own terms, and unknowing to answer it when it finally arrived. The final signal detected in the instant of the giant's destruction remained under active investigation as the story closed, its point of origin traced to somewhere far beyond any coastline monitoring station's normal range. Confirmation that whatever slept beneath that ocean had not been alone in the wider world, only the nearest, and the first to answer a call that was apparently still traveling outward. Hero Association quietly established a new division built entirely around monitoring that signals possible responses, staffed jointly by Dr. Ishikawa's research team, Genos in an expanded advisory role once he fully recovered, and Saitama himself, no longer treated as a variable to be managed from a distance, but as the central figure around whom an entire new category of global defense now openly revolved. Saitama, for his part, returned to his old apartment, and his old routine largely unchanged on the surface, still hunting supermarket sales, still complaining about rent, still deeply unbothered by fame or recognition, even as his name became genuinely known across the world for the first time in his career. But something in him had shifted permanently beneath that familiar exterior, because he now understood, in a way he never had before that morning in the shallows, that his strength was not simply a personal trait to be tested in quiet quarries anymore. It was a force the world itself responded to, one capable of waking things that had been sleeping since long before Hero Association ever existed. Standing on his balcony that final evening, staring out toward a horizon that now felt considerably less empty than it once had, Saitama finished his noodles, set the cup aside, and said quietly to no one in particular that he supposed his training was not actually finished after all, because if one ancient thing had been listening out there, there was no reason to assume it had been the only one. If you made it this far, you already understand this isn't over. Something out there is still listening, and it won't stay quiet forever. Subscribe now, because whatever answers that signal next won't wait for a sequel to warn you. The world already changed once. It's about to happen again.